It started as a chance to redeem myself, or at least that's what I told myself at the time. I had been stuck in the same routine for years, lecturing uninterested students about forgotten civilizations while my career stagnated. I wasn't the young hotshot professor full of promise anymore. I was an aging academic with tenure hanging by a thread. The opportunity to lead the expedition to Panner Creek was the lifeline I'd been hoping for. I needed something big, something groundbreaking, to pull myself out of obscurity. And when the chance to study an abandoned settlement in the middle of the Alaskan wilderness came across my desk, I latched onto it like a drowning man to a life raft. Panner Creek. The name alone stirred something in me, an inexplicable sense of foreboding that I chose to ignore. It was an old mining town, abandoned in the late 19th century under mysterious circumstances. The last records from 1894 told a grim story: harsh winters, dwindling supplies, and something that was only hinted at in whispers: madness, maybe worse. But none of that mattered to me at the time. I saw only the opportunity. If I could uncover what really happened at Panner Creek, if I could solve the mystery of why the town had been left to rot, I could finally make a name for myself. I put together a team of students for the expedition, all eager to escape the monotony of their postgraduate research. There was Hank, pale as a sheet and always battling some sort of illness. Jake, who was usually a jokester but had been unusually quiet since we started our journey. Sam, who was the most enthusiastic, always chasing adventure. And Roy, cocky and dismissive of anything he didn't understand. It wasn't a perfect team, but they were all I could afford. We got an approval from the mining company that still owned the land, packed our gear, and set out for the long journey north. The first real sign that this wasn't going to be a typical field study came when we hit the town of Middleton, the last stop before heading into the wilderness. It wasn't a town so much as a collection of weather-beaten buildings huddled against the cold, as if they were bracing for something worse than just the wind. The locals were hostile, I suppose you could call it. They didn't like outsiders, and they made that clear. As we entered the bar, that dingy, dark place that reeked of stale beer and something more unsettling, every eye in the room turned toward us. I felt like I'd walked into the wrong kind of saloon, the kind where you don't make it out if you ask too many questions. The bartender was an old man, his skin like leather, worn from years of cold and hard living. He eyed us warily, not with suspicion, but with something else, something I couldn't place at first. It wasn't until he spoke that I understood. "You're heading to Panner Creek, aren't you?" His voice was low, gravelly. I nodded, not thinking much of the question. His gaze shifted, and he leaned in close enough that I could smell the soreness of his breath. "You shouldn't go there," he said, almost in a whisper. "It's an evil place." The words hit me harder than I'd expected. It wasn't that I believed him. I didn't. But there was something about the way he said it, the certainty in his voice, that gave me pause. Hank shifted uneasily in his seat, his face even paler than usual. Jake, sitting next to him, managed a weak smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. Roy laughed outright, dismissing the old man's warning as nothing more than superstition. "We've got science on our side," he said, grinning. "Not ghosts." I smiled along with him, but something in me had already started to doubt. We left Middleton the next morning, the sky heavy with clouds that promised snow. The road ahead was long, winding through dense forest, and by the time we reached the outskirts of Panner Creek, it felt like we'd been driving for days. The town, if you could still call it that, sat in a shallow valley, surrounded on all sides by towering trees that seemed to close in on us the further we went. I'd seen old photographs of Panner Creek before its abandonment, pictures of bustling streets, miners working in the hills, wooden houses freshly built. What we found was a ghost town, frozen in time. The wooden buildings had long since started to collapse, their roofs sagging under the weight of years of neglect. Vegetation had taken over, with thick vines crawling up the walls and trees growing where roads once were. The place was eerily silent, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. No birds, no wind, nothing but the sound of our footsteps crunching over the snow-covered ground. It felt like we were intruding on something ancient and forgotten, something that didn't want to be disturbed. Hank was the first to speak up, his voice trembling slightly. "This place feels wrong." I didn't disagree, but I couldn't show any weakness. I had to be the leader. I had to act like I knew exactly what I was doing, even if every instinct was telling me to turn around and get out while we still could. "It's just the isolation," I told him. "Places like this always feel strange at first. We'll settle in." But I wasn't so sure. None of us were. We spent the first few hours setting up camp near what must have been the town's main street. The remains of a general store stood at one end, its windows long since shattered, while the remains of the church loomed at the other, its bell tower leaning at an unnatural angle. I tried to focus on the work, but the uneasy silence made it hard to concentrate. Hank and Jake worked slowly, clearly affected by the eerie atmosphere. Only Sam seemed unaffected, his enthusiasm undimmed as he explored the ruins, already imagining the discoveries we might make. As night began to fall, the wind picked up, howling through the crumbling buildings like a warning. I sat by the fire, trying to keep my mind on the expedition, but the old man's words from Middleton echoed in my head. "It's an evil place." I told myself it was just the isolation, just the cold and the darkness playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew there was something more, something I couldn't explain. We were here now. There was no turning back. By the time we arrived in Panner Creek, the day had darkened into an early dusk, the kind to get up here where the sun barely rises during the winter months. The cold gnawed at our bones, and the silence of the place felt like a weight pressing down on us. No one spoke as we walked through what was left of the settlement, just the crunch of snow under our boots and the occasional groan of a building shifting in the wind. It was as if the town had been waiting for us all these years, frozen in time. And now that we were here, it stirred uneasily, resenting our intrusion. The old buildings, or what was left of them, leaned like brittle skeletons, their wooden beams cracked and sagging under the weight of years of neglect. Vegetation had claimed what remained of the town, with roots and vines snaking through doorways and windows, wrapping themselves around everything as if trying to pull it back into the earth. It was hard to imagine this place once being alive, filled with people, miners, their families, who had lived and worked here. Now it was just us, surrounded by the dense Alaskan wilderness and the ever-present silence. Sam, as always, was the first to break that silence. He'd been eagerly moving from building to building, poking his head into the collapsed structures like an excited child. "This is incredible," he said, his voice cutting through the stillness. "We're probably the first people to set foot here in over a century." He didn't seem to notice the rest of us were more on edge. I tried to muster some enthusiasm, but the oppressive atmosphere weighed on me, and all I could manage was a half-hearted smile. We set up camp near the center of what used to be the main street. Hank and Jake, who had been quiet ever since we left Middleton, worked slowly, their movements sluggish. I could tell the isolation was already getting to them. Roy, for all his bravado earlier, wasn't much better. He kept looking over his shoulder, as if expecting someone, or something, to be watching us. But it was Sam's energy that kept us going. He was buzzing with excitement, already talking about the potential discoveries we could make, completely oblivious to the growing unease among the rest of us. As we began to unpack our equipment, I tried to focus on the task at hand. We were here to conduct an archaeological survey, after all. This wasn't just some wilderness adventure. This was my chance to finally make a name for myself. I couldn't let my own creeping dread get in the way of that. Yet the more I looked around, the more I couldn't shake the feeling that something about this place was deeply wrong. It wasn't just abandoned. It felt untouched, as though it had been waiting for something or someone. Later that day, Sam made the first of what would be many disturbing discoveries. He was rummaging around in the ruins of what appeared to have been the general store when he found it. a human skull, partially buried in the dirt and snow. I remember the way he called out to me, his voice a strange mix of excitement and unease. "Hey, Professor, you're going to want to see this." I walked over, expecting to find some mundane artifact, but the sight of the skull sent a chill down my spine. It was old, sure, but not nearly as old as I would have liked. The bones were brittle, yet they hadn't decayed as much as they should have, given how long this place had been abandoned. There was something else, too. Something about the way the bones had been scattered. It wasn't natural. The thought crossed my mind that the town might have been attacked by wild animals, maybe wolves or bears, but even that didn't feel right. I tried to push the thought away, telling myself it was just an overactive imagination, fueled by the isolation and cold. But deep down, I knew there was more to it. That night, after we set up our tents and lit a fire, I couldn't sleep. The wind howled through the skeletal remains of the town, making the buildings creak and groan like they were alive, like they were whispering to each other about our presence. I kept thinking about the skull, about the way the bones had been scattered. It didn't make sense, but I didn't want to say anything to the students, not yet. I had to stay focused. We were here to work, not to chase shadows. The next day, I found something even more unsettling. In one of the few intact buildings, which I assumed had been a home, I discovered an old journal tucked away in a dusty corner, half hidden beneath a pile of debris. The pages were yellowed and brittle, but I could still make out the faded writing. It belonged to one of the original settlers, a miner who had chronicled his life in Panner Creek. Most of it was mundane, entries about the weather, the work in the mines, and complaints about the cold. But toward the end, the tone changed. The last entries told of a brutal winter in 1894, when the snow came early and supplies ran low. There was talk of sickness, of starvation, of desperation. And then, the journal stopped abruptly. The final page splattered with something dark, something dried and almost rust-colored. I couldn't tell what it was, but the implication was clear. Whatever had happened here in Panner Creek, it hadn't ended well for the people who stayed behind. I didn't tell the team about the journal, not yet. There was no point in scaring them more than they already were. I told myself I would study it later, try to make sense of what the man had written. But as I looked around at the desolate remains of the town, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't the first to be trapped here, isolated by the wilderness and the cold. Hank was the first to go missing. It happened early one morning, just as the faint light of dawn was beginning to push through the thick clouds. The night before, we had all been on edge. There was something about the silence of the place that felt unnatural, and the cold seemed to seep into your bones, no matter how close you got to the fire. I remember waking up in my tent, feeling the chill creep through my sleeping bag. When I stepped outside to check on the others, Hank was nowhere to be found. At first, we thought he might have wandered off to relieve himself, maybe gotten lost in the thick forest that surrounded the camp. But an hour passed, then two, and there was still no sign of him. Jake and Sam scoured the nearby woods, calling out his name, but only the echo of their voices came back. The snow was too thick to follow any tracks, and the wind had already covered whatever trail Hank might have left behind. Roy, always the skeptic, suggested that Hank had simply panicked and run off. But I wasn't so sure. Something about his disappearance felt deliberate, like the forest had swallowed him whole. The unease among the group grew. We were all shaken, but no one more than Jake. I caught him staring into the trees, his eyes wide and nervous, like he was expecting something, or someone, to emerge from the shadows. I told myself it was just nerves, that the isolation was playing tricks on us. But even I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something out there, something watching us. I tried to keep the team focused, reminding them that we were here to do a job, but it was clear that the expedition was falling apart. The next morning, Roy went missing too. I woke up to find his tent empty, his sleeping bag still cold to the touch. This time, there was no mistaking it. He hadn't just wandered off. Something had taken him. Sam and Jake were frantic, demanding that we pack up and leave immediately. But the weather had turned, and the snowstorm that had been threatening us for days had finally arrived. We were trapped. The wind howled outside, and the snow came down so thick that we couldn't see more than a few feet in front of us. There was no way we could leave Panner Creek, not now. That was when I knew we were being hunted. It was the only explanation. The journal I had found spoke of a brutal winter in 1894, of settlers trapped by the snow and driven mad by hunger. I hadn't told the others the full story, but I didn't need to. They could feel it too. There was something in these woods, something old and terrible. I tried to tell myself that we could still make it out, that if we just stayed together, we could survive until the storm passed. But the truth was, I was lying to myself. I didn't believe it anymore. It wasn't long before we found the bones. Sam and Jake had gone out to gather more wood for the fire when they stumbled upon them, half buried in the snow near the edge of the forest. They weren't old bones, like the ones we had found earlier in the expedition. These were fresh, cleanly picked, with the marrow sucked out. Human bones. I remember the way Sam's face went white when he showed them to me. "It's them," he whispered, his voice shaking. "The people who lived here, they're still here." I wanted to tell him he was wrong, that there was a rational explanation for all of this. But the words wouldn't come. The journal had told me what I didn't want to believe. The settlers of Panner Creek had turned to cannibalism to survive the winter of 1894. And now, more than 100 years later, their descendants were still here, still hungry, still hunting. The realization hit us all at once. Hank, Roy, they hadn't just wandered off. They had been taken, dragged into the woods by the inbred descendants of those settlers, twisted by generations of isolation and madness. They were still out there, waiting for the rest of us. Sam was the first to break down. He had always been the most enthusiastic, the most eager to prove himself, but now he was a wreck, pacing around the camp and muttering to himself. Jake wasn't much better, his hands shaking as he tried to keep the fire going. I could see the terror in their eyes, the same terror I felt creeping up my spine. We had come here for answers, but all we had found was death. That night, I barely slept. The wind howled outside, and every gust seemed to carry with it the sound of footsteps, the low growl of something lurking just beyond the light of the fire. I kept thinking about the journal, about the things it hadn't said but had implied. What had happened to the people of Panner Creek wasn't just about starvation. It was about survival, at any cost. And now, we were the prey. The next day, Sam went missing. I don't know how it happened. One moment he was there, and the next he was gone, as if the forest had swallowed him whole, just like Hank and Roy. Jake was a wreck by then, barely able to function. I was no better, trying to hold myself together, but feeling the walls close in around me. We had come to Panner Creek for answers, but now, all I wanted was to leave this place alive. But deep down, I knew the truth. We weren't going to make it out. The cannibals were out there, watching, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. And when they did, we would be just another set of bones, buried in the snow, waiting for the next group of fools to find us. The night after Sam disappeared was the longest of my life. The wind outside our campfire felt colder, sharper, as if it was biting straight through me. It howled through the ruins of Panner Creek, like a chorus of voices whispering warnings we could no longer understand. Jake sat next to me, staring into the fire, his face pale and gaunt. Neither of us said a word. What was there left to say? We both knew that the same fate that had befallen Hank, Roy, and Sam would come for us soon. It was only a matter of time. As darkness settled in deeper, I began to hear the noises. At first, it was subtle, just the snapping of twigs, the crunch of snow underfoot, distant at first, but slowly growing closer. My heart raced, every sound amplifying my fear. They were out there, the cannibals, watching us, waiting for the right moment. I reached for the hunting knife I had packed, the only real weapon we had, but the cold steel in my hand felt useless against the terror that was closing in around us. And then they came. I'll never forget the way they moved, silent and swift, emerging from the shadows like animals. Their forms were barely human, twisted and malformed from generations of inbreeding. They had the same gaunt faces, the same haunted eyes I had read about in the journal. But these were no longer just people. They were predators, driven by a hunger so deep it had consumed their humanity long ago. There were at least 3 of them, maybe more, moving around the edges of our camp, darting in and out of the shadows. Before I could react, they were on us. One of them lunged at Jake, and I saw the flash of its teeth as it sank into his shoulder. He screamed, a horrible guttural sound of pain and terror. I ran toward him, knife in hand, but I was too late. They dragged him into the darkness, his screams growing faint as they pulled him into the woods. I stood there, frozen, listening as the sounds of ripping flesh and cracking bones echoed through the trees. They were eating him. I wanted to help, to do something, but my body wouldn't move. I was paralyzed by fear. I was next. I knew that. I turned, ready to flee, but before I could move, one of the cannibals grabbed me from behind, its grip cold and unnaturally strong. I struggled, stabbing wildly with the knife, but my arms felt weak, as if all my strength had left me. The cannibal pinned me to the ground, its breath hot against my neck. I could smell the rot on its skin, a mix of decay and old blood. I knew this was the end. I was going to die here, just like the others. But then something strange happened. The cannibal hesitated. It leaned closer to my arm, sniffing at the wound I had gotten a few days earlier, that deep bite I had barely noticed in the chaos of Hank's disappearance. Its nose wrinkled, and it backed away, its face contorted in disgust. It let out a low growl and then, just like that, it released me. I scrambled to my feet, too shocked to process what had just happened. The cannibal snarled once more but didn't attack. It turned and disappeared into the woods, leaving me standing there, shaking and confused. I looked down at my arm. The bite mark had become infected, the skin around it swollen and red. And then it clicked. The infection, the rot. They didn't want me because I was bad meat. The thought was horrifying, but it had saved my life. The same disease that was ravaging my body had spared me from their hunger. I didn't waste any time. I stumbled toward the van, my legs barely supporting me. I couldn't think straight. My mind was a haze of pain and shock. But I knew I had to get out. The storm had lessened, but the snow was still thick, and it took everything I had to keep moving. Every step felt like a battle, but adrenaline kept me going. I had to survive. I had to get away from that place. When I finally reached the van, I collapsed into the driver's seat, my body shaking uncontrollably. I fumbled with the keys, my hands trembling, but somehow I managed to start the engine. The van roared to life, and I drove, not caring where I was going, just as long as it was away from Panner Creek. The tires slipped and skidded on the icy road, but I didn't slow down. I couldn't. I couldn't shake the sound of Jake's screams, the image of Sam's broken body being dragged into the woods. I couldn't shake the horror of what we had discovered. I drove for hours, my vision blurring, my mind slipping in and out of consciousness. I didn't care anymore. I just wanted to be as far away as possible from that cursed place. Eventually, the van sputtered to a stop, the fuel gauge reading empty. I was alone, in the middle of nowhere, the Alaskan wilderness stretching out endlessly around me. That's when they found me. The authorities. A search party called in after we failed to check in. I barely remember them pulling me from the van, their voices muffled, distant, like they were coming from another world. I was numb, both from the cold and from the shock. They asked me what happened, but I couldn't find the words to explain. How could I? Who would believe that we had been hunted by the descendants of cannibals, that my infected wounds had been the only thing that saved me? They took me to a hospital, patched me up, but the infection was too deep. I spent weeks in and out of fever dreams, reliving the horror of that night over and over. When I finally recovered enough to tell them what happened, they listened politely, but I could see it in their eyes. They didn't believe me. Not really. They chalked it up to trauma, to isolation. But I know the truth.